Now we're going to take a look at some of the anterior and lateral structures of the skull. Over here we have the zygomatic bone and the maxillary bone, or maxilla. Over here is the nasal bone. Down here we have the infraorbital foramen. Over here is the vomer. And if you look up in here on top, you have the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid. In here you have the middle nasal conch, and below it the inferior nasal conch. The middle conch is part of the ethmoid bone. The inferior nasal conch is a separate part of the facial bones of the skull. It's a separate bone. Over here you have the alveolar process of the maxilla, which is where the teeth will sit. The maxillary teeth, the alveolar process of the maxilla. If you look at the lateral structures, you have the zygomatic process, and on the zygomatic bone you have the temporal process of the zygomatic bone, and you have the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. Temporal process and zygomatic process equal the zygomatic arch. Over here we have the external acoustic meatus, or external auditory meatus. Over here we have the mastoid process of the temporal bone. If you go underneath over here, you have the mandibular fossa, which is where the condylar process of the mandible will sit and articulate as the TMJ, or temporomandibular joint. We'll now take a look at the mandible itself. Over here we have the condylar process. We have the head of the condylar process that articulates with the mandibular fossa of the temporal bone, again to form that TMJ, or temporomandibular joint. We have the mandibular notch, or arch. We have the carotid process. This piece over here is known as the ramus of the mandible. Over here is the angle of the mandible. And then this whole area in here is known as the body of the mandible. This foramen is the mental foramen. And we have the alveolar process of the mandible, just like we had the alveolar process of the maxilla. For the teeth, here we have the mandibular teeth sitting in the mandibula, or the alveolar process of the mandible. On the inside of the mandible, you can see the mandibular foramen. And that's the mandible.